In 1997, a team of acoustic researchers monitoring the deep ocean floor recorded something they could not explain. The signal was so powerful, it was picked up by sensors nearly 5,000 miles apart. It lasted for 1 minute. Then it stopped. Official analysis confirmed it was biological in origin, meaning it came from a living creature. But the sound was louder than any animal ever recorded. Louder than a blue whale by a significant margin. Louder, in fact, than anything science had on record. The researchers named it the bloop, and they traced its origin point to a single location on the map, deep beneath the ice of Antarctica. For most of recorded history, Antarctica was not a place. It was an idea. Ancient Greek philosophers theorized there must be a great southern landmass to balance the weight of the continents in the north. They called it Antipodes, the opposite land. They placed it on their maps as a concept, a philosophical necessity, while without any explorer having ever seen it. For over 2,000 years, it remained precisely that, a shape on a map, a question with no answer. The first confirmed sighting of the Antarctic continent came in 1820, when separate expeditions, one British, one Russian, one American, all spotted the same coastline within days of each other, without any of them knowing the others were there. What they saw was not land in any familiar sense. It was a wall, and a continent-sized shelf of ice rising from the ocean, extending farther in every direction than any of them had the resources to investigate. They turned their ships around and went home. What followed was a long, careful, and largely boring scientific story, at least on the surface. Various nations planted flags. The South Pole was reached in 1911 by Roald Amundsen and, 34 days later, by Robert Falcon Scott. A treaty was signed in 1959, declaring Antarctica a zone of scientific research, off-limits to military activity and territorial claims. The Antarctic Treaty now has 54 signatory nations. Researchers from dozens of countries operate permanent stations on the continent. There are scientific papers published every year about ice cores, atmospheric samples, penguin migration patterns, and the behavior of subglacial lakes trapped beneath 4 kilometers of ice. According to mainstream science, Antarctica is the most studied and least hospitable wilderness on the planet. It is the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. Nothing lives in its interior. Nothing has ever lived there in any human historical period. The continent is geologically ancient, but its story as told in official channels is straightforward. A landmass that drifted into polar position roughly 34 million years ago gradually froze and has remained frozen ever since. That is a clean story. It is a satisfying story. It gives Antarctica the same status as the deep ocean floor or the far side of the moon, an extreme environment of scientific interest, but not of historical mystery. A place where penguins breed and ice cores reveal ancient climate data, and nothing more complicated than that has ever occurred. The problem is the data that does not fit that story, not fringe data, not the output of anonymous online researchers working in their spare time. And that data does not describe a simple, frozen, empty continent. It describes a place that has been doing things that a simple, frozen, empty continent should not be capable of doing. And it begins not with a conspiracy. It begins with a lake. In 1993, Russian scientists drilling through the ice sheet at their Vostok research station in East Antarctica made a discovery that received very little public attention at the time, but that fundamentally altered what science believes is possible beneath polar ice. At a depth of nearly 4 kilometers, 4,000 meters of solid ice above it, they found water. Not frozen water, liquid water. A lake, a freshwater lake roughly the size of Lake Ontario, is sealed beneath the ice and completely isolated from the surface world for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. It was named Lake Vostok, and when scientists began to understand what they had actually found, the implications moved far beyond anything the drilling program had been designed to investigate. A body of liquid water, sealed from the surface atmosphere for 25 million years, is not simply an interesting geological feature. It is a contained environment, an ecosystem in isolation, a biological time capsule that has been running its own experiment for longer than the human species has existed. The heat source keeping that water liquid is not solar. It cannot be. 4 kilometers of ice block every photon of sunlight that has ever touched the surface. The heat comes from geothermal activity, from the Earth itself, which means that whatever is living in Lake Vostok, if anything is living there, has been surviving on geothermal energy, and in total darkness, cut off from every surface process, for a period of time that makes all of recorded human history look like a single afternoon. When samples were finally extracted from the lake water in 2012, the results were published in the journal Science. They contained microbial DNA, not contamination from the drill. Independent analysis confirmed the source was the lake itself. Microorganisms were alive in a body of water that had been sealed since before the first hominids walked in Africa. The official explanation is cautious and measured. These are extremophile microorganisms, life forms adapted to survive in conditions that would kill anything else. This is consistent with life found at deep ocean hydrothermal vents and in other extreme environments. The discovery was exciting, but it was manageable. It fit within the existing framework of biology. But here is what that official explanation does not address. The same satellite and radar mapping technology that identified Lake Vostok has since identified more than 400 subglacial lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. 400 liquid water bodies, spread across the continent, some of them connected to each other through networks of subglacial rivers and channels. Thus, some of these lakes have been sitting in sealed isolation not for 25 million years, but potentially far longer, as long as 34 million years, the estimated age of the ice sheet itself. The geothermal activity that keeps them liquid is not random. Mapping of the subsurface heat signature beneath Antarctica reveals a pattern of geothermal hotspots that is, by any geological measurement, unusually concentrated for a continent this size. One region in particular, centered beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, shows geothermal heat output comparable to active volcanic regions on other continents. Not volcanic in the surface sense, but active, in ways that current geological models were not designed to fully account for. And it was in this same region, this anomalously warm, anomalously active sector of the continent, that satellite imaging in 2016 identified something that made geologists pause in a way that did not make it into the press releases. Geometric structures beneath the ice, not random rock formations smoothed by glacial movement. Geometric, regularly spaced, dimensionally consistent. The kind of shapes that, on any other continent, would prompt immediate investigation under a different classification entirely. The question no one in an official position has been willing to answer out loud is a simple one. What was under Antarctica before the ice arrived? Pillar 1. The Piri Reis Map. In 1929, a map was rediscovered in the archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. It had been drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, and it was assembled according to his own notation on the document. From source maps, he described as very old, charts that predated his own era by an unknown but significant margin. The map depicts the Atlantic coastline of Europe and Africa with accuracy that, for 1513, is remarkable, but not impossible. Standard cartographic technology of the age could account for it. What cannot be accounted for is the bottom edge of the map. Below South America, the Piri Reis map shows a coastline extending east to west across what should be, in 1513, an entirely unknown and unmapped region of the Southern Ocean. That coastline matches, with measurable cartographic accuracy, the shape of the Antarctic coast. Not the ice-covered coast that explorers found in 1820. The rock coast, the geological coastline that exists beneath the ice. That was not mapped by modern science until the 1950s using sonar and seismic imaging technology that did not exist in 1513 or in any recorded historical period before it. When cartographic scholars from the United States Air Force conducted a formal analysis of the Piri Reis map in 1960, They published a finding that was never formally retracted. The map accurately represents a coastline that, at the time of any plausible human mapping, was covered by ice. The only period in geological history when that coastline was exposed and potentially mappable is a period ending approximately 6,000 years ago, before the last major ice expansion covered the continent. The Air Force analysts concluded the source maps used by Piri Reis would have had to have been created during that window, before recorded human history had the navigational technology to reach that latitude. So the mainstream position is that the resemblance is coincidental, that the coastline shown is a distorted rendering of the southern tip of South America, not Antarctica. That is a defensible position. It is also a position taken by people who have a professional investment in the existing timeline of human civilization remaining intact. Think about what that actually means. Pillar 2. Operation High. Jump! And the official silence. In 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy launched the largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica. Operation High Jump, officially classified as a training exercise, was commanded by Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated polar explorers in American history. It involved 4,700 personnel, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier, and 23 aircraft. This was not a scientific camping trip. This was a military operation on a scale consistent with going to war. Thus, the publicly stated objectives were unremarkable. Survey the coastline, establish operational baselines for cold weather military procedure, photograph as much of the continent as possible. The expedition was originally scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted 8 weeks. The ships came home early. No official explanation was provided for the shortened timeline. Yet no comprehensive results were ever publicly released from the aerial photography program that was one of the mission's stated primary objectives. Admiral Byrd, in a press conference following his return, made a statement that was widely quoted and then quietly stopped being quoted. He described encountering, during the mission, an enemy capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, and he specifically described aircraft that were unlike any technology his forces possessed or had encountered during the war. He stated that the threat from this source was one that America needed to take seriously. He was a 4-star admiral with a record untouched by controversy. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was debriefed and then never spoke publicly about the subject again. Most people never get told this part. The classified files from Operation High Jump were partially declassified decades later. The released sections cover logistics, weather data, and administrative records. The aerial survey results, the photographs from more than 40,000 miles of coastline overflights, are documented as having been taken. They are not in the released files. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act for their location have been returned with the response that records of this description cannot be located. 4,700 personnel, 23 aircraft, 8 weeks, and the photographs went somewhere that is not available for anyone to look at. Can this really be random? Pillar 3. The UFO incident pattern. Antarctica has the highest concentration of formally reported unidentified aerial phenomena per square kilometer of any location on Earth. That is not a claim from a tabloid. It is a pattern visible in the officially registered reports submitted by research personnel stationed at Antarctic bases over a period of decades. In 1965, personnel at the Argentine Deception Island base formally reported and documented a structured aerial object moving at speeds inconsistent with any aircraft technology of the period. The report was submitted through official military channels, signed by multiple witnesses with professional rank, and entered into the Argentine Naval Record. It is accessible. It has never been retracted or explained. In 2004, as a research team from the British Antarctic Survey operating near the Weddell Sea reported a structured object tracking their vessel at low altitude across multiple hours of observation. Photographs were taken. The report was filed. The official response was that the object was likely an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, a label that covers a great deal of distance between what was seen and what can be explained. The pattern across these reports is consistent in ways that atmospheric phenomena do not explain. The objects described move against wind. They maintain structured shape over extended observation periods. They respond to changes in the observer's behavior, adjusting course, changing altitude, terminating observation by accelerating to speeds beyond visual tracking. These are not the behavioral signatures of weather phenomena. They are the behavioral signatures of something making decisions. And they cluster, geographically. The reports do not distribute randomly across the continent. They concentrate in the same sectors, the same anomalously warm, anomalously active regions that the subglacial lake mapping and geothermal surveys have identified as geologically unusual. The same regions that contain the largest and deepest of the subglacial water systems. The same regions where the geometric subsurface structures were identified in satellite imaging. That is not one anomaly, as that is a location where multiple independent categories of anomaly converge. And that convergence is exactly the kind of pattern that, in any other investigative context, would not be called coincidence. It would be called a sight. Pillar 4. The Ancient Maps and the Civilization Question. The Piri Reis map is not alone. It is the most famous in a category of historical documents that cartographic historians refer to as anomalous pre-modern maps. Charts that contain geographical information that should not exist at the time of their creation. The Oronteus Phineus map of 1532 depicts a continent at the South Pole with interior mountain ranges and river systems drawn in the style used by cartographers who had observed them directly, not inferred their existence from theory. Thus, on the Oronteus Phineus map exist beneath the ice. They were not visible in 1532. They are barely accessible to measurement technology today. The Boache map of 1737 presents the most puzzling case of all. It depicts Antarctica not as a single continuous landmass, but as two separate islands divided by a sea channel running through the interior of the continent. That depiction has no geographical basis in the form Antarctica currently takes. No channel divides it. But subglacial mapping in the 20th century revealed that beneath the ice, the Antarctic continent is not a single landmass. It is two landmasses, separated by a basin that, if the ice sheet were removed, would fill with ocean water and become exactly the sea channel shown on the 1737 Boache map. The Boache map was drawn 130 years before the first humans confirmed the continent existed. It shows a feature of Antarctic geography that was not known to modern science until the 1950s. And it shows it accurately. The only explanation that the standard timeline of human history can offer for documents like this is an error, an extraordinary, specific, and repeatedly accurate error that somehow matched the hidden reality of the continent across multiple independent cartographers working in different centuries and different countries. That is one possible explanation. It requires you to accept that random error consistently produces accurate results, and that was only the beginning. Pillar 5. The Nazca Parallel. When archaeologists study sites of unexplained ancient construction, say they apply a test that rarely gets discussed publicly. The resource question. Every deliberate construction project in human history requires three things: materials, labor, and a reason. When those three factors cannot be satisfactorily explained within the known capabilities and motivations of the civilization credited with building something, the site moves into a different category of investigation. Antarctica presents a version of this problem that has no parallel on Earth. The subglacial structures identified in satellite and radar imaging in the Ross Ice Shelf and Marie Byrd Land regions are not single anomalous formations. They are distributed across an area of hundreds of square kilometers with a regularity that geological processes, even extraordinary ones, do not produce. Rock does not form right angles under ice. Glacial carving produces curved, abraded surfaces, not the dimensional consistency visible in the imaging data. The structures sit at depths that place them within the geological time window of the last period when Antarctica's interior was ice-free and temperate. Climate modeling and geological core sampling have established that West Antarctica in particular experienced periods of dramatically reduced ice coverage as recently as the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago is not the deep geological past. It is within the time frame of early human civilization. It is contemporary with the construction of the oldest megalithic sites on other continents. What if a civilization that existed during that window, a warm, temperate, accessible Antarctic, built something? What if the ice came faster than they could leave? What if what is sitting under 4 kilometers of ice is not a geological curiosity but an archive, the physical remnant of the civilization that produced the maps that somehow survived into the records of Piri Reis, Orontius, Phineus, and Buache? The question of who was on Antarctica before the ice is not a fringe question. It is the question that the available physical, cartographic, acoustic, and biological evidence is quietly but persistently pointing toward. You don't think that is a coincidence, do you? Pillar 6. The Lake Vostok Signal. Return to Lake Vostok for a moment, because the story of what was found there did not end with the microbial DNA result published in 2012. In the years following the initial extraction, subsequent sampling and analysis of the lake water returned something that the research team published in a paper that received almost no mainstream media coverage. As alongside the microbial sequences consistent with known extremophile biology, the genetic analysis also returned sequences that could not be matched to any known organism. Not sequences that were mutated or degraded versions of known biology. Novel sequences. Genetic structures that the researchers described, in the language of peer-reviewed scientific caution, as not yet assigned to any known phylum, which is a scientific way of saying, we have never seen this before, in anything, anywhere. Most the lake has been sealed for 25 million years. In isolation, biology evolves. It diverges from surface life in proportion to how long it has been separated. 25 million years is enough time for life to become something genuinely and profoundly unrecognizable compared to its surface cousins. What is alive in Lake Vostok may share a common ancestor with life on the surface, but may have traveled so far from that ancestor that nothing in the current biological classification system has a category for it. That is, the conservative interpretation. The conservative interpretation is already extraordinary enough to occupy a generation of biological research. But the deeper question, the one the bloop was asking back in 1997, is not about microbes. It is about the scale of what might be operating in a sealed system of 400 connected lakes, geothermally heated, biologically active for tens of millions of years, spread across an entire continent of dark water that humanity has barely touched. The bloop was biological in origin. The equipment that recorded it was designed to detect the movement of nuclear submarines. The signal it recorded was louder and came from something larger than anything on the surface of this earth has ever produced. Something very large made that sound, and it came from under the ice. Step away from the data. Let all of it settle. The maps, the lakes, the signals, the military operations and their missing records, the geometric shadows under 4 kilometers of ice. Let all of it be still for a moment, and then ask the real question. Not what is under Antarctica, but what it means for all of us, if the answer to that question is anything other than nothing. The story of human civilization has a beginning date, not a precise one. Historians and archaeologists argue about the margins, but a general consensus. Complex human civilization, by the standard academic account, begins somewhere around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Writing appears. Cities form. Agriculture stabilizes. The record begins, and everything before that threshold is classified, more or less as prehistory, a period of hunter-gatherers and nomadic groups, biologically identical to us but too scattered and too simple to leave the kind of record that survives. That timeline depends on one foundational assumption. It assumes that the geographic regions where civilization could have emerged were accessible during the period in question. It assumes there was no temperate, the habitable landmass that subsequently became inaccessible. buried under an ice sheet thick enough to take 6 months of drilling to penetrate. Antarctica is larger than Europe. During the warm periods of the last ice age, before the final advance of the ice sheet locked the continent into its current state, the western portion of the continent was not the frozen wasteland it is today. Climate reconstruction from ice cores and sediment samples indicates it supported conditions comparable to Patagonia or Iceland. Cold, demanding, but survivable. And survivable means habitable. And habitable means possible. If a civilization existed on Antarctica during that window, even a small one, even a primitive one by our current standards, it would have had to move when the ice came. Or it would have been covered, and if it moved, it took something with it. Knowledge. Navigational knowledge. Cartographic knowledge. The memory of a landmass that the rest of the world had no way to reach or verify. Knowledge that eventually, degraded by centuries of copying and retelling, found its way into the libraries of Ottoman admirals and French cartographers who recorded it without fully understanding what they were preserving. That is one angle. What it means for human history. Here is the other angle, what it means for you. Of the human instinct that something vast and ancient is being kept just beyond reach, that the full story of where we came from has never been told in any classroom or textbook, is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. Something in us has always known the official story was not the complete story. Every civilization that has ever existed has had its version of a lost golden age. A time before this time, a world before this world, a knowledge that was possessed and then somehow lost, buried under catastrophe, under ocean, under ice, under the weight of centuries that couldn't carry it forward intact. We do not invent those stories. We inherit them. They come from somewhere. They have always come from somewhere real. Since the truth may be that what we are searching for when we look at Antarctica, what draws satellite cameras and military expeditions and researchers willing to spend months in the coldest place on Earth, is not an alien civilization at all. It may be our own. The part of our own story that the ice took before history was ready to write it down. The chapter that exists only in the shapes of coastlines drawn by hands that no one can name anymore. In the memory of acoustic instruments detecting movement in dark water. In the geometry of shadows sitting 4 kilometers beneath the surface, waiting for an instrument sensitive enough to read what they say. This is not just a mystery about a frozen continent. This is a mystery about the length of the human story, about how far back it goes, about what existed before the ice, and whether what existed before the ice is the reason that ice came when it did. The record was not always frozen, as something was there before the cold arrived. And it may still be there now. So here is the question I leave with you tonight. If Antarctica was habitable 12,000 years ago, if something lived there, built there, knew where it was on the face of the Earth well enough to map its own coastline, where did it go? And why has every significant expedition to that continent in the modern era returned with either silence, missing records, or a report of something encountered that no one in an official position was willing to put a full name to? What is under the ice? And who decided that the answer to that question should be so very difficult to find? Share your theory below. I want to know what you think is down there. Ancient civilization, extraterrestrial installation, something else entirely. The comments on this channel are never predictable, and that is exactly why I read them. If this opened something in you. Our video on Operation High Jump goes deeper into what the classified records do say, and what the men who came back from that mission said when no one was recording officially. If this moved you, a thumbs up carries it to the next person who is ready to hear it. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.